A werewolf shifter romance audiobook. The air turned thick with storm and winter pine the instant the door behind me opened. Alpha Adrian's polished smile was already in place, offered to the man now filling the threshold, but the moment his gaze slid to me, that smile shattered. Shock, then disgust, raw and unmistakable, filled his gaze. Alpha King Reese. Adrian attempted to mask his disgust. I must apologize. This foolish servant didn't realize we would be meeting here. I dropped my chin in the smallest nod I could manage. This was the Alpha King. Nothing good could come from me stumbling through here. Adrian grabbed me roughly by the shoulders and started to move. She will be going now. She can speak for herself. The Alpha King's aura made us both freeze. Something electric, forbidden, slid down my spine. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, and it terrified me. What's your name, girl? I have spent my whole life in a pack that didn't value me, that took whatever pieces of me they wanted and punished me for the ones they couldn't break. My father, the Alpha at the time, allowed it to happen, and eventually even imprisoned me. When he died, instead of things getting better, they just got worse. My stepsister and her brother-in-law turned cruelty into an art form. I am wolfless, and I am mute by choice, having learned that silence is my safest option, safer than the truth, safer than a scream. But I am not as weak as they think I am. Now, Alpha King Reese has come for a visit in hopes of finding a bride, and my whole life is changing. Nothing I knew is as it seemed, and now I'm slowly starting to unravel the messy truths I was left with. With the Alpha King's influence, I am beginning to find myself, piece by piece. But am I just a pawn in his game? He's had others before me. Is he the one I have been waiting for? Will I survive the mess I've been left in? Or will I find myself crumbling before I can ever find the answers that await me? I'm in too deep now, and if I go down, I could be taking the Alpha King down with me. Chapter 1. The Cage and the Crown's Shadow. The dishwater was the color of weak tea and the temperature of a dying fire, barely warding off the persistent chill of the stone scullery walls. My hands were pruned and raw, accustomed to the abrasive scrubbing of the pack's daily grime. It was a chore meant to keep me hidden, meant to remind me of my place, a silent, wolfless ghost confined to the shadows of the estate. I dipped a heavy ceramic bowl, the silence of the scullery my only companion, save for the rhythmic clank of metal against porcelain. I preferred this silence. It was predictable. It was safe. It allowed me to exist without fear of being overheard, misinterpreted, or punished. My voice, years ago, had been deemed a weapon, or perhaps a liability. And I learned quickly that the best fortress was one built of stillness. But even the thick stone could not mute the sharp edges of Luna Kinsley's voice when she was truly irritated. It sliced through the walls, high-pitched and dismissive, carrying through the back entrance just beyond the swinging door. "It is an insult," Kinsley was saying to Adrian, her words crystal clear and edged with contempt. A clear, calculated insult. He is the Alpha King, Adrian, and he has been circling the Northern Territories like a vulture for months, pretending to look for a bride. He could have chosen any of the high blood packs. Instead, he chose us. The tension in Kinsley's voice told me everything, fear and a desperate hunger for status. Reese was coming. Alpha King Reese. The name was a low, chilling vibration in the pack's history. Whispers painted him as a male of impossible power, a figure known for his chilling gaze and his ruthless efficiency. He didn't seek alliances. He demanded submission. He wasn't looking for a mate. He was looking for a tactical advantage. The thought of his sheer, unrestrained force occupying this space, our safe little cage of cruelty, sent a tremor of real terror through me. I instinctively shrunk further into the gloom, water dripping from my fingers. My routine, the comforting repetition of scraping, rinsing, and drying, was my only anchor. I focused on the cold porcelain, trying to sink myself entirely into the mundane task. He has nothing to do with me. But Kinsley's voice persisted, driving a cold spike into my heart. And the audacity of the royal advisor to demand new silver service, as if our own silver isn't polished enough. Truly, Adrian, the man acts as though he is dining in a pigsty. He knows our status, Adrian's low voice rumbled back, laced with a familiar frustration that often preceded him losing his temper and finding me. He's simply pressing, and we will comply. His visit guarantees protection from the Eastern rogues. The bride is secondary. Their conversation was a perfect metaphor for my life here. I was the pigsty they were constantly trying to hide, the mistake they polished over with lies and superficial beauty. I pulled a heavy, tarnished silver platter from the bottom of the sink, the kind they only used for the highest-ranking guests. The metal was slippery, slick with grease and the foul-smelling soap. The sight of that platter, that symbol of high society, snapped something loose in my mind. It wasn't the platter itself, but the echo of Kinsley's sharp, unforgiving tone. It was the same tone my father, the former Alpha, used when he spoke about me to the pack elders. A sudden, sharp memory flared. I was 7, presenting him with a wildflower. He didn't look at the flower, he looked at my hands, muddy from the earth, and then at the elders. She is too soft, too distracted by nonsense. A true shame, her wolf never surfaced. His words, devoid of emotion, had been worse than a blow. They had been the declaration that I was useless, an anchor around the pack's neck. And not long after that, the physical prison had been replaced by a psychological one. My fingers spasmed, reacting to the phantom sting of that old rejection. The heavy, tarnished silver platter slipped from my grasp. It didn't drop softly. It fell against the edge of the granite counter with a dull, sickening thwack, then skittered across the wet stone floor, stopping just inches from the swinging door. My blood ran instantly cold. That sound, it was loud enough to carry, loud enough to stop a conversation. It was the sound of my existence violating their required perfection. Adrian's volatile temper was well known, and Kinsley was utterly ruthless. I had just presented them with the pigsty they were trying to hide. I scrambled, terrified, dropping to my knees to retrieve the platter. My hands were shaking too badly. I was clumsy, fumbling. Before I could even reach the handle of the platter, a new sound, deeper and more terrifying than Kinsley's voice, vibrated through the floorboards. The low, throaty rumble of heavy engines, a sound that spoke of security details and armored prestige. The motorcade. He was here. Adrenaline flooded my system, overriding my fear of Adrian. I had to disappear. Now. If the king's arrival was delayed or marred by a clumsy, wolfless mute in a dirty apron, Kinsley would ensure my retribution was swift and permanent. I gripped the platter, shoving it hastily back toward the sink, and then, moving purely on instinct, I grabbed the nearest cleaning rag, darting through the door. I didn't have time to retreat to my tiny, cramped room. I had to move into the main house, to the back corridor, and vanish into the maze of linen closets before anyone could see me. The hallway was dimly lit, designed to funnel guests toward the bright, grand ballroom. I kept to the far wall, my head ducked, feet silent on the ancient rugs. I could hear Adrian's voice, now smooth and obsequious, greeting the king in the foyer ahead. The reception had begun. I was almost safe, just feet from the dark recess of the staff pantry, when a sound stopped me dead. A sudden heavy pressure in the air. It wasn't just Reese's scent of storm and pine, which was now overwhelming. It was the sheer mass of his authority, pushing down on the very molecules of the house. I froze, pressed flat against the wall, listening to the exchange I knew would determine my fate. Adrian's forced joviality and the deep, resonant timbre of the king's voice. I could hear only half the conversation, but I heard the king's low voice saying something about discretion and private counsel. My heart hammered a desperate code. I had to wait until they moved past. But then, as I held my breath, 2 figures moved into my peripheral vision, not 2 feet from where I was hiding. Adrian, trying to lead the king into the library, and the king himself, a wall of black fabric and raw masculine power that swallowed the light. And then, disaster. Just as I thought I was clear, I must have shifted my foot slightly. Or perhaps the scent of fear radiating off me was too strong. The king paused. He stopped following Adrian and turned his massive frame, his senses zeroing in on the tiny, trembling servant pressed into the shadows. The door behind me opened. Alpha Adrian's polished smile was already in place, offered to the man now filling the threshold, but the moment his gaze slid to me, that smile shattered. Shock, then disgust, raw and unmistakable, filled his gaze. Alpha King Reese. Adrian attempted to mask his disgust. I must apologize. This foolish servant didn't realize we would be meeting here. I dropped my chin in the smallest nod I could manage. This was the Alpha King. Nothing good could come from me stumbling through here. Adrian grabbed me roughly by the shoulders and started to move. She will be going now. She can speak for herself. The Alpha King's aura made us both freeze. Something electric, forbidden, slid down my spine. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. And it terrified me. His voice dropped, rich and dangerous, commanding my immediate attention. What's your name, girl? I could only look up, catching the full intensity of his molten silver eyes, overwhelmed by the storm and frozen earth of his scent. Chapter 2. The King's Insistence. I couldn't breathe, not with Alpha Adrian's furious grip still burning into my arm, and certainly not with the Alpha King's gaze drilling into the core of my silence. The scent of pine and frozen earth, his scent, was so potent it tasted metallic on my tongue, suffocating the air I desperately needed. "What's your name, girl?" he had asked, his voice a low, beautiful command. My mind raced, scrambling for the single, simple syllable he required. Grace. But the word wouldn't form. It was a muscle I had atrophied through years of forced silence. Every time I had tried to speak in the past, a hand had clamped over my mouth, or worse, a punishment had followed, teaching me that the safest option was to lock the sound inside. Now, even freedom felt like danger. Adrian, sensing the tension, recognized the colossal threat of keeping a king waiting. He spoke quickly, trying to cut me out of the narrative. "Your Majesty, I apologize again," Adrian interjected, his voice sickeningly smooth now. "As I explained, Grace has been mute for many years. A regrettable illness. She cannot provide you with a name herself. It is simply Grace. Now, if you would follow me. The library is ready for your private counsel." He tightened his grip on my arm, intending to propel me backward, away from the foyer and the king's curiosity. The Alpha King didn't move. He didn't even look at Adrian. His silver eyes remained locked on mine, waiting. It was a terrifying test of wills. Adrian was trying to claim ownership of my silence, of my status, but the king saw the lie beneath the submission. Then, the air shifted. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Reese lifted one massive hand and placed it, not on my shoulder, but lightly, deliberately, on Adrian's wrist, the wrist holding me captive. The pressure was minimal, but the subtext was a micro-threat of massive power. Adrian froze instantly, his jaw slackening, the polished facade finally cracking to reveal pure fear. The king hadn't touched me, but he had asserted authority over my captor. "I was not addressing the current Alpha Adrian," Reese said, his voice dropping to a register that was both velvety and chilling. "I was addressing the girl, Grace." He held Adrian pinned with that subtle pressure for another agonizing second before releasing his wrist. Adrian stumbled back a half step, rubbing the spot where the king's power had momentarily crushed his own. The attention snapped back to me, more focused, more demanding than before. Reese took a second step closer, reducing the gap to an unbearable distance. I could feel the residual heat from his body, the overpowering scent that now felt less like cold earth and more like a contained inferno. He lowered his head slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor, then back up to my face. "If she cannot speak her name, perhaps she can nod. Grace, is that your name?" My throat was dry, painfully constricted. I forced my chin to dip once, a rigid, frantic motion of compliance. "Good," Reese murmured, a sound of grim satisfaction. He didn't look impressed by my obedience. He looked disappointed by my fear. "And Grace," he continued, and this was the question that terrified me most, the one that required a spoken answer. "Why do you wear the scars of the wolfless when you carry the scent of the wild?" The question was a direct punch to my internal armor. It ripped apart Adrian's carefully crafted lie about an illness and went straight to the heart of my identity, fear, and trauma. Adrian instantly stepped forward, radiating panic. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, the girl is a former servant. Her silence is a known issue. Her history is not relevant to our treaty talks, and I assure you, silence is not empty. It's full of everything you refuse to say." Rhys cut him off with a gaze so cold it was physical. The king ignored Adrian entirely, focusing on my reaction. He had called my silence a fortress, and now he was trying to breach it. He was pressing into my pain, not to inflict more, but to expose the wound and see if I would bleed defiance instead of fear. I realized with chilling clarity that he saw me as a puzzle piece that didn't fit Adrian's picture, and he was determined to use me to destabilize his host. I shook my head immediately, intensely. "No," I tried to convey with my eyes, my panicked movements. "My history is too relevant. It will ruin everything. I couldn't survive if he dragged my truth into the light, and I certainly couldn't survive Adrian's retribution." "You fear him," Rhys observed, his voice low, stating a fact, not asking a question. His silver eyes flickered between my face and Adrian's rigid stance. "And you fear me more than him?" I flinched, the admission of fear unavoidable. Yes. Adrian was a predictable monster. Rhys was an unknown deity of destruction. Rhys finally turned to Adrian, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. "I have decided, Alpha Adrian, that I require Grace to attend to me tonight at dinner. Personally, she will be the sole servant allowed in the dining hall." Adrian's jaw dropped. The command was an absolute humiliation, a direct public removal of Adrian's authority over his own staff and household. "Your Majesty, that is unnecessary. We have dozens of perfectly trained serving wolves ready to attend to your needs." "I prefer a silent audience," Rhys said simply, his silver gaze returning to me, intense and possessive. "It encourages transparency in my hosts." He meant, "I prefer to watch the truth unfold." He gave me another firm nod, a clear instruction. Then, he turned and walked past the defeated Alpha Adrian, disappearing down the main hall to the pre-arranged meeting room. Adrian let out a quiet, guttural sound of pure rage. His mask had completely disintegrated. He spun on me, his eyes dark with murderous fury, but he couldn't touch me. Not yet. The king's command was a silver shield. I felt a dizzying surge of power, not my own, but borrowed. It was the thrill of surviving a direct confrontation with Adrian by simply existing in the king's peripheral vision. As Adrian stormed off to regroup with Kinsley, I stayed rooted to the spot, trembling but strangely steady. I felt the slow, warm burn of the king's touch, the implied intimacy of his command, traveling from the tips of my hair to the soles of my feet. He was testing me, but more importantly, he was protecting me, even if only as a political pawn. I lifted my hand, pressing my fingers against the spot where Adrian's grip had been. The pain was gone, replaced by the ghost of a question. Why? Rhys had demanded my presence at the most high-stakes event of the evening. It was no longer about hiding. It was about performing on a tightrope, high above the pack, knowing that any mistake I made could lead to my final fatal fall. He hasn't tasted my fear yet, but he will. Chapter 3. Scent, Subtext, and Shame. The grand dining hall was a torture chamber of light and noise. Every crystal goblet reflected the blinding gleam of the chandeliers, and every conversation felt like a carefully aimed dart. I was dressed in a clean, but still rough, tunic, positioned precisely 2 steps behind the Alpha King's chair, a silent statue in the most prestigious room of the pack house. My sole, agonizing task was to anticipate Rhys's needs, refilling his water, offering the wine, presenting the platters. It meant an unbearable level of forced proximity. Every time I leaned over his massive, broad shoulder, the pure, overwhelming scent of him, storm, pine, and something uniquely masculine, suffocated my senses. I could feel the heat radiating off the expensive fabric of his suit, the steady, heavy rhythm of his breathing. The contact was purely professional, yet every subtle interaction felt like a slow, deliberate burn against my skin. Luna Kinsley sat directly across from him, draped in emerald silk, her eyes constantly flicking toward me with a venomous mix of disbelief and proprietary fury. Adrian, seated beside her, looked like a coiled spring, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes while navigating the delicate political conversation with the king. "The Eastern Territories are secure, Your Majesty," Adrian was saying, his voice thick with unearned confidence. "We handled the incursion last spring with minimal losses. It speaks to the discipline of our perimeter patrols." "Discipline or desperation?" Rhys countered smoothly, taking a slow sip of wine. I reached out to pour him more water, my hand trembling slightly as the silver carafe neared his glass. The entire table was watching, but Rhys's eyes were focused on the swirling water, and then, briefly, on my unsteady wrist. "Desperation is often the precursor to discipline. Wouldn't you agree, Grace?" Rhys asked, not looking at me, but directing the question right into the tense, subtext-heavy space between us. The question was a masterful, calculated jab at Adrian, using my voicelessness as a weapon. It implied that I, the lowest member of the pack, knew more about true desperation than their alpha did. Adrian went rigid. Kinsley's smile thinned into a razor edge. I didn't dare nod or move. I just held the water carafe steady, returning to my station. My silence was not empty. It was full of everything I refused to say. The countless times Adrian had cut back rations, the casual theft of my grandmother's heirloom jewelry, the brutal rules that kept me confined. "Your Majesty must excuse the servant," Kinsley cut in, dripping saccharine concern. "She is a sensitive girl. I'm afraid she wouldn't understand the nuances of governance." Rhys finally looked up, his silver eyes cold as ice, sweeping over Kinsley's glittering facade. "I find sensitive people often understand nuances better than the powerful, Luna Kinsley. They are the ones forced to pay attention to details." The air crackled. Rhys was defending me, not because he cared, but because he saw a tool, an anomaly in Adrian's perfect hierarchy, and I was clinging to the razor-sharp edge of that borrowed protection. I leaned down to clear the starter plates. As I reached for Rhys's finished porcelain, my fingers brushed the back of his hand. It was the slightest contact, accidental on my part, but I swear his skin was fire. The simple spark sent a dizzying rush of pure, raw craving through my lower body, a sensation so intense it made my knees weak. I quickly pulled my hand away, heat rushing to my face, and that's when it happened. Rhys's expression, previously cold and strategic, shifted. He caught my eye for less than a second, a fleeting, intense glance, and saw the flush, the involuntary reaction, the raw, beautiful defiance that was fighting against my ingrained shame. His mouth curved, not into a smile, but something infinitely warmer, more predatory, like a wolf scenting prey it already knew belonged to him. Kinsley, enraged by the silent exchange, decided she had enough. "Your Majesty, I truly must apologize for this ridiculous spectacle," she announced, her voice pitched to ensure every guest heard the condemnation. She focused her glare now entirely on me. "We tolerate Grace out of old duty. She has a history of failures. She is not only wolfless, but she was entirely useless when my father, the late Alpha, was ill. She lacks discipline, commitment, and frankly, she should never have been allowed outside the kitchen today." The attack was cruel, calculated to inflict the deepest possible shame by detailing my wolfless status and past failures in front of the king. My stomach clenched. I stood rigid, letting the wave of shame wash over me, preparing to retreat internally as I always did. But before Kinsley could continue the litany of my faults, Rhys put down his fork. The faint clink was louder than a gunshot. Enough, he commanded, his voice utterly devoid of volume, yet vibrating with an absolute deadly authority that silenced the entire hall. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest. His gaze was fixed on Kinsley, but his words were meant for everyone. Your words, Luna Kinsley, are noise. Her silence is a fortress. He had chosen my side. He had defended my greatest weakness, my inability to speak, and transformed it into a weapon against them. Rhys then turned his head, looking up at me, his eyes piercing through my sudden, grateful shock. Clear the glass, Grace. I moved forward instantly, retrieving his empty wine glass. My entire body was vibrating with the unexpected defense. As my fingers closed around the stem, Rhys moved his hand, not to grab the glass, but to deliberately brush my knuckles, a warm, firm pressure that lasted a full, heart-stopping second. The contact was electric, a simple spark of craving that made me feel alive for the first time in years. It was a promise, a confirmation of the bond of tension forming between us. Then, he released the glass. I stumbled backward, clutching the fragile stem, dizzy with the realization that he was not just defending a pawn, he was stoking a fire. Not yet, my body screamed. I am not ready for this fire. I retreated to the shadows, the warmth of his touch still searing my skin, while the political discussions resumed, their voices muffled by the thunder of my own pulse. The scent of sandalwood and frozen earth, his scent, followed me, a relentless reminder that the king had seen my defiance, tasted my silence, and was now actively searching for the key to my cage. Chapter 4. The Library's Secrets. The lingering, electric sensation of the Alpha King's touch remained on my knuckles, a secret heat I carried back into the chilling stone of the scullery. Adrian hadn't risked a public reprimand after Rhys's chilling defense, but the fury in his eyes had been a promise of retribution once the king departed. I worked quickly, mechanically, scraping the remnants of the banquet, trying to quiet the frantic hammering of my heart and the dizzying echo of Rhys's voice. Her silence is a fortress. He had protected me, but protection from a king was never free. The final, high-pitched ringing of a wine glass being put away signaled the end of the night's diplomacy. I was scrubbing a stubborn stain on a silver spoon when the scullery door swung open, not with Adrian's heavy, angry force, but with a quiet, deliberate movement. I spun, dropping the spoon with a small splash. It was Rhys. He stood in the humid, dark kitchen, a king in exile, his imposing silhouette framed by the harsh hallway light. He wasn't flanked by guards. He was alone. This was not a public command. This was a secret audience. Adrian believes you are being punished for the spill. Rhys's voice was a low vibration, making the water in the sink tremble. He believes you are scrubbing until dawn. I found that convenient. I stared at him, my breathing shallow. He shouldn't be here. This was my cage, my hidden domain. His presence here felt like a violation of the only safety I had left. I need to know the truth of this pact, Grace, he continued, taking a slow step toward me, his silver eyes cutting through the gloom. Not the glossy history Adrian and Kinsley provided, but the real one. Your father, the former Alpha. What did he hide? I shook my head, my shoulders hunching. I can't. It's too dangerous. My silence was an immediate, terrified refusal. Adrian's power stemmed from those hidden truths, and digging them up was lethal. Rhys stopped a foot away from the counter, resting his hands on the marble. The physical tension between us instantly ratcheted up, the proximity unbearable in the small enclosed space. I could smell the leather of his clothes, the lingering scent of his wolf. Fear is a choice, Grace, he challenged, his gaze softening slightly, becoming impossibly deep. I understand why you chose silence. I understand the cost of a spoken word here, but if you wish to survive the mess you've been left in, you must learn to communicate without it. I lifted my hands, palms open, then tightly clenched them, a clear, nonverbal communication of my trauma and the family pressure that had crippled me. They locked me in. Yes, he acknowledged, understanding instantly. Your father used that lock. Adrian turns the key. I want to know what you saw from inside the cell. He moved closer still, testing my space. He didn't touch me, but the sheer weight of his presence was an invasion. He was using his body as a subtle press, leveraging his raw power to force an emotional response. He was discussing my past, my pain, with a knowing air that made my stomach twist. I know Adrian is a tyrant. Reese's voice was now truly a low voice, meant for my ears alone. But I sense a deeper lie beneath his cruelty. Why is this house so cold? Why are the packlands stagnant? Tell me what Adrian fears you know, Grace, even if you don't know the words for it yet. I couldn't speak, but I could move. I snatched a piece of charcoal used for polishing silver, and with trembling fingers, drew a crude, symbolic image on the nearest clean wall space. A grand, ancient tree, its roots running deep, and a thick, deliberate line cutting through the trunk. A rupture. I pointed to the roots. Old. I pointed to the cut. Broken. I pointed to the ground beneath the cut, where the tree was now diseased. The foundation is rotten. Reese watched the performance with unnerving calm, his silver eyes following every movement, every frantic line. When I finished, I stepped back, my chest heaving. It was the most complex communication I had managed in years, a tiny act of rebellion using the only tool I had: truth. A slow smile, genuinely amused and deeply satisfied, spread across his face. A language of defiance. I like it. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavily bound book, the same cryptic ancient text he had been referencing at dinner. It was heavy, smelling of dust and age. He placed it directly on the wet counter between us. This is an ancient registry, Grace. Too boring for Adrian to notice, but too old for him to dare destroy. It details the founding lineages of this territory before the modern pack system took hold. His gaze intensified, moving from the book to my eyes. Adrian is looking for a smooth transaction. Kinsley is looking for a title. I am looking for a reckoning. And for that, I need a new perspective. He leaned in, his mouth close to my ear, his breath warm and dangerous against my neck. You are a lock. I am the man who has always preferred the combination to the key. He wasn't talking about my silence anymore. He was talking about my identity. He straightened, took one last, lingering look at the charcoal drawing I had made, and then turned to leave, vanishing as quietly as he had arrived. He left me with the heavy book and the crippling fear of Adrian's discovery. I snatched the book, wrapping it immediately in a clean, dry cloth before the moisture could damage the brittle pages. I was shaking, less from fear of Adrian, and more from the dizzying potential of the task Reese had given me. He wanted me to find the lie in the pack's history. I tucked the book beneath my tunic, holding it tight to my ribs. This was no longer just about survival. It was about the dangerous thrill of participating in the downfall of my abusers. It was the first step of my true rebellion. Later, confined to my narrow, cold room, I finally pulled out the book. The ancient script was beautiful, detailing generations of names, blood ties, and land claims. I flipped through the pages frantically, looking for anything that contradicted Adrian's polished narrative. My breath hitched when I found a short, cryptic passage detailing a forgotten law relating to a wolfless lineage, a bloodline anomaly whose unique physical marker entitled them to authority over the pack's ancient holdings. The description of the marker was precise: a cluster of 6 dots, the shape of a crooked star, hidden just beneath the hairline at the base of the neck. My fingers flew to the nape of my own neck, pushing aside the short, rough hair that always escaped my braids. Beneath the skin, I felt it, a familiar, faint, raised pattern I had always dismissed as a birth injury. 6 small, dark spots, perfectly arranged. The Alpha King hadn't been testing my silence. He had been testing my identity. He didn't just want a bride or a pawn. He wanted the missing piece of the pack's crown, and that piece was me. Chapter 5. The Price of Proximity. The heavy registry book, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in my room, felt like a ticking clock. I knew Adrian or Kinsley would search for it eventually. The pressure they were under from Rhys guaranteed they would soon turn their attention back to the lowest, most vulnerable member of the house. I couldn't sleep. The knowledge of the crooked star birthmark on my neck, a sign of a forgotten, powerful lineage, had fundamentally altered my sense of self. I wasn't just wolfless anymore, I was an anomaly, and perhaps a secret heiress. The fear was still a lead weight in my stomach, but now it was mixed with a terrifying, addictive pulse of power. I slipped out of my room long after the house had settled into its deepest, most guarded sleep. I wasn't running, I was searching. I was drawn by the primal sound I had heard faintly that evening, the raw, animalistic sound of a king's power unleashed. I found myself near the edge of the manicured estate grounds, where the grass gave way to the dense, wild perimeter forest. The night air was sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the musty dread of the house. And then I heard it clearly. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a wolf landing after a massive jump, the tearing scrape of claws against earth, and the low, guttural snarl that was part of a shift, part of a release. Rhys. Training. Shifting. I crept to the shadow of a colossal oak, peering into the moonlit clearing. The sight stole my breath. He wasn't in his formal suit. He was simply male, stripped down to a pair of loose, dark trousers, his back to me. His skin was slick with sweat, gleaming silver in the moonlight, and the muscles of his back and shoulders were coiled cables of immense fluid strength. He moved like a dancer and fought like a god. He was the living embodiment of the raw, untamed power he tried to contain behind the veneer of a diplomat. This deep, hidden space was where the king surrendered to his wolf. I stayed silent, utterly still, watching the dangerous, mesmerizing display, feeling the hot, uncontrollable rush of craving spread through my blood. This was the true source of the power that had protected me at dinner. This was the source of the scent that promised storm and wildness. I knew the exact instant he sensed me. His movements didn't falter, but they changed. They became predatory, aware. He finished his final, brutal set of drills, breathing heavily, the sound deep and ragged in the stillness. He didn't turn around. He simply stood, a dark, muscled silhouette, his head bowed. "You should not be here, Grace." His voice was rough, altered by the recent intensity of his shift, closer to a growl than a command. I stepped out of the shadow of the oak. No words, just my quiet, undeniable presence. I couldn't run. The desire to see him, to share his secret space, was too strong. He turned slowly. His silver eyes were darker now, reflecting the raw focus of his wolf. The scent of sweat, ozone, and pine hit me full force, a powerful, intoxicating cocktail of danger and masculinity. He covered the distance between us in 3 long, deliberate strides. He stopped impossibly close, forcing me to tilt my head back just to meet his gaze. I felt the overwhelming pressure of his body heat, the air around him charged and heavy. Sensual heat bloomed across my skin, a dizzying recognition of the power he held over me, and the strange power my presence held over him. He was testing my limits, pushing past the safety of my bodily autonomy with proximity alone. My instincts screamed at me not to submit entirely. I couldn't speak, but I could draw a boundary. I slowly, deliberately, lifted my hand and pressed my palm flat against his chest, not pushing him, but claiming a small space for myself. It was a clear, non-verbal plea for respect, for space, and an act of sheer, terrifying defiance. "Don't use your power here." His heart hammered against my palm, strong and steady. "You are brave," he murmured, looking down at my hand pressed against his skin. "Or foolish. You should fear me more than anyone in that house." I shook my head, my eyes wide and pleading. "I fear what you represent. I fear the change you bring." "Why did you watch me?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low purr that resonated deep within my own core. I simply pointed to the dense, dark woods, and then to the rough apron I still wore, and then back to the raw power of his body. "You are freedom, I am confinement. I came to look at what I cannot have." A flicker of something painful crossed his eyes, a depth of emotion I hadn't expected. He reached up, and I flinched, bracing for a punishment. Instead, his fingertips gently brushed the side of my neck, just above where I knew the crooked star mark was hidden. The gesture was possessive, almost tender. "I have seen 1,000 pretty smiles," he said, his voice husky with sudden vulnerability. "I have never seen a truth this sharp." He dropped his hand, and I felt the profound loss of his touch instantly. "I came here for a queen, Grace, someone who would stabilize my kingdom and command respect. Instead, I found a silent woman in a scullery who fights me with her eyes. My wolf stirred for you when you put your hand on my chest, not because you were afraid, but because you claimed the space." He admitted it. His wolf desired me. This wasn't about politics or the registry book. This was about raw, escalating intimacy and primal attraction. He was forcing me to confront my own identity fear by showing me the power my wolfless status didn't extinguish. He stepped back, his chest heaving once with a deep, cleansing breath. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a heavy, intricately carved silver cuff. Not jewelry, but a symbol of protection, stamped with the royal crest. "Adrian and Kinsley's power is physical. It is visible. Their claim over you must be broken by something stronger and more public," he explained, holding it out. "Wear this. It is a promise. No one in this pack is permitted to touch you, punish you, or command you except through me. It ends their control." I hesitated, looking at the cuff. It was a gilded cage, but a cage that offered sovereignty. It was the rupture Adrian and Kinsley feared most. I slowly reached out and took the silver, feeling its cool, heavy weight. It was the first gift I had ever received, and it felt like a declaration of war. Rhys watched me, his silver eyes dark and satisfied. "Go, Grace. Hide your history, but wear my protection. I will see you tomorrow." I quickly fastened the cuff around my wrist, a visible, undeniable rupture with my past. The metal was cool against my skin, but inside, I was burning with the realization that I was no longer Adrian's servant, but the Alpha King's highly visible anomaly, and I was more terrified and more alive than I had ever been. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Armor. The silver cuff was heavy on my wrist, a constant, cool presence that felt both like a shackle and a shield. It was the color of Rhys's eyes, and it made me visible in a house where invisibility had been my only survival mechanism. It announced my new, terrifying status to everyone. Owned by the king, hands off for the pack. Luna Kinsley's fury was a palpable thing. It didn't manifest as screaming. It was colder, sharper. She treated the silver cuff like an infectious agent, refusing to look at my wrist, but sending poisoned glances at my face. Adrian, however, couldn't stop looking. His eyes were drawn to the crest like a moth to a deadly flame, confirming that Rhys's gift was indeed a rupture in their power structure. This entire day was thick with family pressure, and the crushing weight of classism turned on its head. I was dusting the elaborate glass chandelier in the main foyer, a chore usually reserved for 3 days of labor, when Adrian cornered me. The house was empty, preparing for the evening's formal reception, which would force Rhys to stay another night. He didn't grab me. He couldn't. The fear of that silver cuff, and what the Alpha King might do if he heard of a bruise beneath it, was too strong. He simply blocked my path, his face rigid with barely contained violence. "You think you've won, little servant?" Adrian hissed, his voice low and dangerous, forcing me to look up into his dark, furious eyes. "You think his toy makes you immune? Rhys will leave, he always does. And when he does, that bauble won't save you from the reckoning." He was right. But something had changed in me since I'd pressed my hand against Rhys's heart in the moonlight. I wasn't just the mute girl anymore. I was the keeper of a secret and the wearer of a king's crest. I met his gaze, holding it, and slowly, deliberately, lifted the arm with the silver cuff. I didn't speak, but I didn't need to. I pointed pointedly at the crest, then tilted my head toward the large, ornate clock in the hall, conveying a clear, simple threat. Hurt me now, and Reese will know about it before the clock strikes dinner. The message landed. Adrian's jaw tightened, and he swallowed, his fear of the king momentarily eclipsing his hatred for me. He spun away with a frustrated snarl, realizing he was utterly powerless as long as the silver remained on my wrist. The small victory was a dazzling, potent rush. Hours later, the house was ablaze with light and music. The reception was a sea of glittering dresses and bespoke suits, and I was back in the shadows, helping the catering staff. But I wasn't hiding, I was waiting. Then a hand touched my back, a firm, non-negotiable contact that was not Adrian's clumsy grasp, but Reese's familiar, searing heat. "You will dance with me, Grace," he ordered, his voice an undertow beneath the swell of the orchestral music. Before I could protest, or nod in terrified compliance, he pulled me gently but irrevocably onto the main floor. The king, dancing with the scullery girl. The music was a slow, formal waltz, forcing us into immediate, intimate contact. His hand was a brand on the small of my back, his thumb resting just above the dip of my waist. The crowd dissolved. It was just him, his scent, and the frighteningly small distance between our bodies. This was pure physical tension, a dance dictated by breath, scent, and careful, mature dialogue that only I could hear. "You communicated your threat to Adrian very clearly today," Reese murmured, his silver eyes watching the other guests, but his focus entirely on the subtle tension in my posture. "You are learning to wield your silence like a sword." I leaned in, my mouth close to his shoulder, communicating non-verbally with sharp, frustrated movements. "I don't want to be a sword. I want to be safe." "Safety is a myth, little storm," he countered, pulling me closer. His grip was possessive, yet somehow respectful of my boundaries. "But power is real, and you possess a claim to power Adrian tried to bury. Your father's tyranny, Adrian's cruelty, it wasn't just about making you suffer," Reese continued, his voice dropping to a serious, low tone that sent shivers down my spine. "It was about suppressing the truth of your lineage. There is a dark, forgotten law regarding the WOLFLESS, a bloodline anomaly that, when paired with the royal line, destabilizes the entire system." My breath hitched. The old registry, the crooked star. He knew. I shook my head violently against his shoulder, communicating profound fear. "It's impossible. I have no wolf." He pulled back just far enough to meet my eyes, the silver intense. "Wolfless is a diagnosis, Grace, not a sentence. I believe the pack, specifically your father, actively suppressed your shift because your wolf, or lack thereof, made your claim to the ancient lands too strong. They wanted you to be weak so they could hide the existence of a bloodline that trumps theirs." The revelation landed like a physical blow. The shame I carried, my identity fear, was a manufactured weakness. My silence, my lack of a wolf, was the ultimate defense mechanism against a power I was never meant to have. "The greatest lie is the one you whisper to yourself in the mirror." Reese's words were a demand for me to see my trauma as a calculated strategy against me, not a personal failure. The music swelled, signaling the end of the waltz. He led me off the floor, his hand remaining anchored to the small of my back, far longer than necessary. We paused near the edge of the room, separated from the throng by the sheer magnetic field of the king's presence. He looked down at me, his eyes dark with unexpressed emotion, acknowledging the fierce, undeniable chemistry that had been raging between us throughout the dance. He didn't speak of his desire. He spoke of the delay. His hand finally moved from my back, dragging his fingers slowly, agonizingly, across my skin before settling briefly on the silver cuff. His touch was a promise and a question, heavy with desire. He leaned in, his mouth close to my ear, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that bypassed my ears and went straight to my core. "Not yet." Then he was gone, moving toward the pack elders, leaving me vibrating in the silence. The simple act of his touch, his admission of restraint, had stripped me bare. My emotional armor was cracking, and all I could think about was the moment "not yet" became now. Chapter 7. The Confession and the Promise. The scent of him was a siren song, pulling me through the dark, silent corridors of the house long after the reception ended and the last guests had gone. My nerves were frayed threads, still vibrating from the proximity and the pressure of the waltz we had shared. "Not yet," he had whispered. And that refusal had done more to escalate my desire than any direct pursuit. I held the ancient registry book tightly to my chest, a peace offering and a symbol of my desperate reliance on him. I had to know the full extent of the danger the lineage secret posed, and I needed to return the book before Adrian's paranoia led to a targeted search of my room. I found his private suite in the east wing, shielded by heavy mahogany doors. The air outside was thick with the scent of an impending storm, and a low, persistent drumming of rain had begun against the tall windows. I raised my hand to knock, but the door was already yielding to the slightest pressure. It wasn't locked. He had been waiting. He was standing by the window, the glow of the distant city lights silvering the silhouette of his powerful frame. He wore a simple, dark shirt, unbuttoned at the throat, and the raw, untamed look from the clearing had returned to his eyes. The room was heavy with anticipation and the clean, overwhelming scent of storm and pine. I closed the door behind me, the soft click sealing us in a bubble of dangerous intimacy. "I knew you would come," Reese stated, his voice a gravelly texture, confirming that the air between us was not accidental, but intentional. He turned fully, gesturing to the book in my hands. "Did you read enough to confirm my suspicions?" I nodded, my breath catching. I walked forward slowly and placed the book on the heavy table between us. Then, using deliberate, stark gestures, I communicated the depth of the conspiracy. I pointed to the book, then traced the shape of the crooked star on my neck, and then drew a tight circle around my mouth, indicating my enforced silence. They knew what this sign meant, and they took my voice to control the power. Reese listened, motionless, his silver gaze never leaving my face. This was not the strategic king. This was the emotionally deep male who saw my survival mechanisms as a language. He didn't interrupt, allowing me the space to detail the unspeakable. I pantomimed the casual cruelty, the way Adrian had looked through me, the constant fear of the scullery, every memory that constituted my lifelong trauma. I drew on the table the image of a wolf, then placed an X over it, showing how the pack had deliberately suppressed my nature. When I finished, exhausted and shaking, Reese didn't offer false comfort. He simply walked to me, stopping only inches away. He lifted his hand and very carefully, very slowly, brushed the hair away from my neck, exposing the faint, star-shaped mark. His touch was the firmest confirmation I had received that my pain was real, and that it was justified. "You have suffered a tyranny of silence," he whispered, his eyes dark with a deep, private sorrow. "I have suffered a tyranny of sound." He reached out and gently took my hand, placing it over the rapid, hard beat of his own heart. "My wolf chose you, not because you were broken, but because you were unbreakable. I came here looking for an escape from my own past, Grace." Reese revealed his own deep vulnerability, a past duty he had failed, a necessary sacrifice he had been unable to make, which resulted in the loss of a key ally and stained his reign with political weakness. It was a secret that drove his desperate search for stabilization. He wasn't just a king seeking power, he was a male running from shame. I needed stability, and I thought a political marriage built on the ancient laws would provide it, he confessed, his voice rough. "I intended to use your lineage to secure the Northern Territories, Grace. I admit it. I intended to use you as a powerful pawn." I stared at him, the truth cold and hard, yet somehow less painful than the lies I had lived under. The fear of being a pawn was real, but now he had placed his own truth on the table, achieving surrender on both sides. He lifted his other hand and gently framed my face, his thumb brushing the corner of my lower lip, tracing the silent boundary of my mouth. His silver eyes searched mine, looking for anger, fear, or rejection. But all I felt was the rising, undeniable tide of desire, a physical truth that cut through all the political lies. The rain outside intensified, a sudden violent downpour matching the chaos inside me. The tension peaked, a taut wire stretched between our bodies, begging to snap. Instead of pulling away or submitting, I made a choice. My fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, demanding the contact. And then, I broke my silence. Not with a word or a scream, but a sound. A soft, involuntary sound of need. A deep, guttural ah that escaped my throat. The first audible sound I had made in years, caused only by the fire of him. He inhaled sharply, his control shattering. The scent of pine and storm overwhelmed the room as the rest of the world disappeared entirely behind the roar of the rain. I woke with a profound sense of loss. The sheets cool against my skin. The room was empty. Rhys was gone. My heart immediately seized with panic. Had he used me? Had he discarded his pawn after securing the information he needed? The terror of betrayal, the deep trauma inflicted by my father and Adrian, threatened to pull me back into the safety of my mute shell. I sat up, scanning the room frantically. The ancient registry was gone from the table, but on the pillow next to mine lay a single crisp piece of parchment, folded neatly. It smelled faintly of his wolf. I snatched it up, my eyes devouring the precise masculine script. I didn't come here for a crown. I came here for a reckoning. The note continued, short and stark. My duty starts now. I cannot remain here and risk your safety. You have awakened the ancient truth within you, Grace. Your rebellion has begun. Adrian will move now that I have left. The final line was a demand, a terrible challenge. The truth is a fire, and you, little storm, are about to be the ash and the flame. I gripped the note, feeling the paper crinkle under my palm. I was alone, exposed, and protected only by a promise. The fire was coming, and I had just traded my safe silence for the volatile noise of a king's reckoning. Chapter 8. The Dark Revelation. The cold had returned. With Rhys's scent of storm and pine gone from the house, the sterile, oppressive chill of Adrian's dominance settled back in, thicker and heavier than before. I gripped the silver cuff on my wrist and the handwritten note in my pocket, the only evidence that the intoxicating intimacy of the night before had been real. Adrian will move now that I have left. I didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, the house was plunged into a subtle but palpable chaos. Servants moved with frantic speed, their eyes wide and darting. The whispered tension indicated a discovery had been made. Adrian had found the ancient registry book. He hadn't needed to search my room. Rhys had taken the book with him as a necessary piece of evidence. But Adrian, having discovered the king was gone, likely ran to the library only to find the book missing, confirming Rhys's interest was not merely political, but deeply invasive. The door to my narrow room burst open, startling me so badly I nearly cried out. Adrian stood there, framed by the light, but there was no mask, no feigned civility. His face was distorted by pure, cold panic and absolute hatred. Kinsley was behind him, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "The registry!" Adrian snarled, his voice guttural. "What did you tell him, you pathetic little mistake? What lies did you use to draw the king's eye?" I stood my ground, clutching the linen shirt I had been mending. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the fear was different now. It wasn't paralyzing. It was a fuel, a terrifying, potent energy. The king had given me the truth. I just had to survive long enough to use it. Adrian lunged forward, stopping only inches from my face. "He told you about the lineage, didn't he? He told you that filthy, ancient lie about the wolfless blood." He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging in hard, pulling me back to the crushing reality of my past. "You are nothing. You are a discarded piece of trash, and you will die here before you ever challenge my power." He shoved me roughly toward the old iron-framed bed. "You are confined to this room. You will not leave. If you try to communicate, if you utter a sound, Kinsley will ensure you wish for the silence back." The act of confinement, being locked back into this small, miserable space, was a direct, sickening attempt to reimpose the trauma of my childhood, to force me back into the obedient, mute creature he remembered. But Adrian had made a critical mistake. He hadn't removed the silver cuff. He slammed the door shut, the heavy lock clicking into place, plunging the room into shadow. I slid down against the wall, fighting the rising tide of despair. The terror was overwhelming, but Adrian's panicked confirmation that the lineage was indeed a threat to him was the single, beautiful thing that kept me from crumbling. I forced myself to breathe, focusing on the cool, metallic weight of the cuff. It was a tangible link to Reese and the truth. Adrian expected tears, despair, and submission. He expected the old grace, but I had the clarity of Reese's honesty and my own secret knowledge. I pushed myself back up, moving to the tiny, barred window. I found a loose stone, wedged deep in the frame, and began to chip away at the mortar around the edges. I wasn't trying to escape. I was making noise. Loud, deliberate, scraping noise. I knew Kinsley would be listening outside the door, convinced I was defeated. I wanted her to hear the resistance. I wanted her to panic. I wanted the sound of my slow, steady destruction of the house to echo the slow, steady destruction of their lies. Kinsley's sharp, terrified voice finally came through the door. "Stop that! Stop that immediately, you wicked thing! Do you want Adrian to come back and finish what he started?" I kept scraping. I couldn't speak, but I could make noise. I could choose the sound I made. It wasn't just noise. It was an act of raw, silent empowerment. The desperate fury in Kinsley's voice told me everything. My noise, fueled by Reese's truth, was shattering her composure far faster than my silence ever could. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. A powerful, chilling roar ripped through the estate, a sound that was pure Alpha King, pure primal rage. It was closer than I could have imagined. Reese had not gone far. He was back. The house shook. The lock on my door rattled violently. I heard Kinsley shriek, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. The scent of storm and pine was suddenly, gloriously, overwhelming, filling the tiny room, pushing out the stale air of fear. The door flew inward, torn from the frame. Reese stood there, his chest heaving, his silver eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying intensity I had never witnessed before. He was a beast of muscle and dark focus, looking every inch the king who had come for a reckoning. Adrian was crumpled in the hallway behind him. Reese's gaze swept the room, taking in my terrified state, the damaged door, and my silver cuff, still stubbornly on my wrist. He hadn't come for an explanation. He had come for justice. He strode into the room, stopping directly in front of me, his massive hands resting on my shoulders, gentle yet possessive, checking for injuries. He looked back toward the crumpled figure of Adrian. "You mistook her silence for weakness. That was your first and last mistake." The king had not abandoned his pawn. He had only retreated to gather his forces. He was here to protect the secret he had unleashed. I reached up, my hand brushing the back of his neck. A silent question. "Why?" He answered by pressing his forehead briefly against mine, sharing his ragged breath, his fear for my safety overwhelming his political composure. He stepped away, his body still shielding me, and his eyes fell on a dusty, discolored patch of wallpaper near the hearth, a spot I had always assumed was simple water damage. He crouched down, tearing away the paper with a violent snap. Beneath it was a small, sealed cavity in the wall. He reached inside and pulled out a stunning, ancient portrait wrapped in velvet. The image was of a woman. She possessed the same small, delicate features, the same sharp jawline, and the same quiet defiance in her eyes that I saw in my own reflection. She was regal, dressed in the formal attire of the ancient royal line. He didn't need to tell me. I recognized the ghost of my own face. My mother. Reese turned the portrait, pointing to the delicate inscription etched into the back of the frame. It detailed her lineage, the forbidden bloodline, and confirmed that she, too, was wolfless, a powerful woman forced into secrecy. The truth wasn't just in the registry, it was in my very blood, my very identity. The crown wasn't just a political advantage, it was my birthright. My journey was no longer just about survival, it was about reclaiming the power stolen from my ancestors. Chapter 9. The Reckoning and the Voice. The atmosphere in the pack hall was no longer one of polite negotiation. It was a battleground carved out of mahogany and marble. Rhys stood at the head of the room, his presence so immense and absolute that the air felt thin, barely breathable. He hadn't just defeated Adrian, he had exposed him. Adrian and Kinsley were now huddled near the fireplace, their former regality dissolved into desperate, petty fear. The handful of remaining pack elders sat frozen at a long table, watching the Alpha King dismantle their governance in real time. I stood at Rhys's side, feeling exposed but strangely steady. The portrait of my mother, the hidden queen, rested against the back of the dais. The evidence was overwhelming. The ancient registry book, which Rhys had retrieved, lay open to the page detailing the wolfless lineage. Rhys's voice was a low, relentless hammer, detailing Adrian's calculated abuse, the deliberate suppression of my history, and the fraud that had kept him Alpha. The late Alpha, Rhys stated, his voice carrying clearly to every corner, did not die of natural causes, as you reported. He died of shame after I discovered his attempt to bury this ancient bloodline. His son-in-law, Adrian, simply accelerated the cover-up with relentless cruelty toward the only living heir. Kinsley let out a sharp, choked gasp, recognizing the full, terrible extent of their exposure. Her eyes, wide and manic, darted between Rhys's accusation and my silver-cuffed wrist. "It's a lie!" Adrian finally burst out, sweat slicking his forehead. "A ridiculous, outdated myth. The girl is mute. She has no wolf. She is a curse on our pack. Not a claimant to the throne." Rhys ignored him, turning to the pack elders. "The lineage is the true source of this territory's ancient title, and the right to choose the next path belongs not to the tyrant, but to the victim of his deceit." The final decision, the choice of what happened next, was mine. I felt the immense weight of every eye in the room. The sheer pressure of that inherited authority was crippling. Adrian expected revenge. The elders expected continuity. Rhys expected strength. My throat constricted, the familiar pain returning. My duty was simple: claim the title. Become the new Alpha. Use the power Rhys had given me to secure my future. I could sentence Adrian to exile, strip Kinsley of her status, and finally be safe. But safety bought with someone else's destruction, even a destructive tyrant, felt too much like my father's rule. I looked at Adrian, his face now truly pathetic, defeated, and I saw a cycle, the oppressed becoming the oppressor. My trauma screamed at me to take the power, to ensure I was never weak again. But the clarity Rhys had awakened in me fought back. I wasn't fighting for a crown. I was fighting for identity and reform. I focused on the cold, hard weight of the silver cuff on my wrist, Rhys's gift, and the lingering memory of his confession. I came here for a reckoning. I took a shaky breath and stepped away from the king, moving out of his protective shadow and directly into the center of the hall, where Adrian had once stood so proud. My empowerment wouldn't be found in wearing Adrian's crown. It would be found in shattering the throne's foundation. I lifted my gaze, meeting Adrian's terrified eyes. This was the moment of decision, the true climax of my silent life. The air was so still I could hear my own heart frantic drum against my ribs. I forced myself to focus on the fear in his eyes. I pushed past the years of shame and the layers of silence, channeling all the pain, all the fear, all the raw, forbidden desire that Rhys had ignited in me. I forced the air past the glass in my throat. It was raspy, raw, and trembling, but it was there. A sound I hadn't made in years. Stop. It was a single, audible, adult word. It was my first true word in years. It was a command. The entire hall froze, stunned by the sound of the mute girl speaking. Adrian physically recoiled, recognizing the ultimate rejection of his tyranny. I raised my chin, fixing my gaze on Adrian, the silver cuff glinting fiercely. I spoke again, slower, clearer. The sounds agonizing to produce, but infinitely potent. Your rule ends. I didn't claim the pack for myself. I didn't announce my own rise. I simply stripped him of his legitimacy, using the truth Rhys had brought to light. The truth that Adrian had only been a figurehead. Adrian crumpled to his knees, his last resistance dissolving. I felt an exhilarating, dizzying surge of clarity. I was not running from responsibility. I was returning stronger, having faced my fear and claimed my voice. I turned to the elders, then to Rhys, communicating the next step with a sharp, decisive shake of my head. I would not accept the title. I would not rule under the old, corrupted laws that had oppressed me. The pack needed healing, not a new tyrant. Rhys dismissed the elders with a sharp flick of his wrist. When we were finally alone, just the two of us, Adrian and Kinsley left cowering in a corner, Rhys walked to me, his silver eyes dark with emotion. "You chose wisely," he said, his voice quiet, filled with pride. "You chose reform over vengeance. You chose the harder path, Grace. That is why my wolf chose you." He reached out, his warm, strong hand cupping the side of my face. "I must tell you the full truth of my plan," he confessed, his voice dropping low, sharing a vulnerability that was more intimate than any touch. "I told you I intended to use your lineage to secure my kingdom. That was the truth of the strategy. But the truth of the heart is this. I stayed because of you. I left only to force Adrian's hand and to gather the final legal means to protect you and your mother's legacy. I didn't trust myself near you. Yet I needed to secure your future." He met my gaze directly. The pawn became the only piece I cared to win. I fell for the silence that challenged me, the truth you communicated without sound, and the strength beneath the servant's apron. "My original plan is void, Grace. I no longer seek a political arrangement. I seek a partnership. You are not a prize, Grace. You are the architect of the new dawn." I reached up, placing my hand over his, where it touched my cheek. The vulnerability in his gaze was staggering. He wasn't just a king. He was a man who had offered me a mutual surrender. "The throne you sit on," I rasped, the words coming easier now, "is built on the oppression of people like me. I will not sit on it until those laws are broken. I need to use this voice, to change everything that allowed them to treat me as less than human." He smiled, a slow, genuine, breathtaking curve of his mouth. "Then we will break them together." He released my face and instead held out his hand, palm up, not in an offer of service, but of absolute equality. "Come with me, little storm, not as a Luna or a mate, but as my partner. We will use your history, your wolfless status, your courage, and your new voice, to reform the kingdom's darkest laws, ensuring no wolf or wolfless suffers such classism again. We will build a reign of truth." I placed my trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and the contact felt like the promise of an unstoppable future. My throat ached, but the word that formed was full of hope and a terrifying new sense of sovereignty. Yes, the true battle was just beginning. Chapter 10. Surrender and Sovereignty. I walked out of the pack hall with Rhys, my hand laced securely in his. The marble floor, which hours ago had felt like an execution block, now felt like a foundation. Adrian and Kinsley were gone, exiled from the territory, their legacy of cruelty replaced by a chaotic, powerful hope. The rising sun was casting long golden shadows across the grounds, illuminating the world we had just violently changed. The air felt clean, scrubbed of Adrian's fear and Kinsley's venom. My throat still ached from the shock of speaking, but every breath I drew was a choice, a declaration of ownership. Rhys didn't lead me to the motorcade and the high politics of his royal capital. Instead, he led me toward the perimeter forest, the same dark edge where I had watched him shift, where the tension between us had first become undeniable. This was the place where we were stripped of our titles, leaving only the man and the woman. We sat together on an ancient, moss-covered log, the world silent save for the birds and the gentle sweep of the wind through the pines. My heart was full, yet heavy. The victory was immense, but the trauma was still a fresh wound. "I heard your voice, Grace," Rhys said, turning to me, his silver eyes warm with an affection that melted the coldness I had carried for so long. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. But I heard the pain in it too. We've won the battle for the territory, but the battle for your peace is just beginning. I nodded, resting my head against his shoulder. The scent of storm and pine was no longer threatening. It was home. I couldn't speak easily yet, but the need to communicate my intentions was immense. I lifted my hand, drawing the symbol of the broken crown onto the moss with my finger, then pointed to the portrait, my mother's face, then to my own throat. The laws that hurt me must be broken now. Rhys listened, his hand stroking my hair, his attention absolute. He wasn't the king who demanded compliance. He was the partner who offered respect. "I understand," he murmured. "The laws that define a wolf's value are centuries old, built on fear and classism. They are the root of your father's tyranny. We will use your history, Grace. We will use the wolfless heir as proof that their entire system is fraudulent." "It will be dangerous," he warned, shifting so he could look into my eyes, his tone suddenly serious. "Changing these laws will challenge every powerful alpha who benefits from the system. It will invite assassination attempts. It will make us both targets." I reached up, touching his jawline. I couldn't speak the full sentiment, but my eyes held the truth. I am already a target. I choose the danger with you. He understood. He smiled grimly, admiring the ferocity in my gaze. "My purpose has shifted, Grace. I came here seeking political power, but I found my reason for being. I found the truth I needed to build a reign of justice, and that truth is you." He turned, holding my face in his strong, beautiful hands. This was a moment of complete surrender, not of power, but of heart. "My wolf chose you not for the throne, but for the fire you carry," he confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr. "I was afraid of this depth of feeling. I didn't want a mate who was an anomaly. I wanted stability. But the moment you pressed your hand against my chest in the clearing, I knew stability was irrelevant. Only you mattered." I closed my eyes, absorbing the profound confession. The man who had been defined by duty and power was confessing love through vulnerability. This intimacy, the silent, shared vision for a better future, was the deepest form of love I had ever known. He pressed his forehead gently against mine. "I promise you this, on my blood and my wolf, your voice, your choices, your body, they belong entirely to you and to our partnership. Always. No one will ever silence you again. My desire for you is absolute, but your bodily autonomy is my first law." His kiss was profound, not frantic or demanding, but slow, deliberate, sealed with the promise of his absolute consent and fidelity. The sensual heat between us, always a wild, uncontrolled flame, settled into a deep, steady inferno, the warmth of belonging and mutual respect. I pulled back, gazing at the faint, silver-white scar near his temple, a mark of the king's lineage I had never noticed before, a subtle flaw that made him human. He smiled, understanding my visual question. "The wolf is not the whole story, Little Storm. We are a union of the known and the anomalous, a partnership built to defy tradition." I finally understood the meaning of my existence. My wolfless status wasn't a wound. It was the very thing that made me the unique solution. My journey had been about overcoming identity fear by embracing the one part of me the world had rejected. My silence had not been empty. It had been a crucible, forging the woman I was meant to become. I reached out, taking his hand, And for the first time, the word came easily, full and resonant, a promise to myself and a declaration to him. "We start with the children," I insisted, the word clear, though still quiet. "No more shame, no more cages." Reese squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with pride. "As my partner, your first decree will be the protection of the innocent. We will build an academy for the wolfless, funded by Adrian's forfeited assets." We stood together, watching the sun climb higher, melting the frost from the pine needles. The scent of sandalwood and frozen earth, his scent, mingled with the rising steam of the morning forest, creating a new fragrance of hope and partnership. The Alpha King had claimed the woman who had been rejected by her family, and in doing so, she had claimed sovereignty over herself. He looked toward the horizon, where his kingdom lay waiting, no longer a responsibility, but a calling. He lifted my hand, placing a lingering, worshipful kiss on the silver cuff. "I found my voice, Reese, and now I have everything to say. I was no longer a servant, or a pawn, or a mistake. I was Grace. I was his partner, and the world, challenged by the strength of my quiet defiance, was waiting for the fire of my voice. The true reign had just begun. The end.